The BIZZARE Revival of the EU4 Board Game. People have been playing board games for thousands of years, with the oldest playable board game in the world being the royal game of Ur, that originated in ancient Mesopotamia 4,600 years ago. Although sadly, we have no one alive today to tell us the exact date of when it was created. What many of you don't realise, or have just realised now when clicking on this video, is that EU4 originally came from a board game developed in 1993. Now obviously, the PC game, Europa Universalis 4, you see today is now completely different to the original make of a board game, Europa Universalis, and EU4 took the Europa Universalis series to a new height, bringing in a significantly bigger audience, which is mainly due to a large amount of innovation and development over 8 years given to the game. This brings us to the question of why this company created the new board game for the Europa Universalis series, called The Price of Power. In some ways, this could potentially be seen as a regression in innovation, going back to the 1990s, rather than a step forward into something like virtual reality EU4, or EU4 on the next-gen consoles. So in this video, we try to understand this somewhat bizarre revival of the EU4 board game, and why it was remade at the end of the day. But before we get into the video, if this video gets 3,000 likes, then I'll consider making a video playing the EU4 board game with members of the Discord. And if you like this sort of content, why not consider subscribing? So the first thing we're going to discuss that gives us a reason for this board game revival is that we need to determine whether there is a big enough market for this game. Now this board game audience would firstly come from anyone who had an interest in Europa Universalis 4, and it's quite clear that EU4 has a significant audience, with over 2 million copies sold by February 2021. And EU4 also has an active audience, since Paradox have consistently made expansions to the game that people willingly buy. Therefore, this game is one of Paradox's flagship games, and so clearly there would be some form of interest from individuals in an EU4 related game, which you will see later on in the video. The other market they'd also have to look at is the board game industry, and whether people are still interested in buying board games. From my research, there clearly is still an interest in board games, particularly around Christmas times. I'm sure you've been there, when you have to play awkward Christmas games with the whole family. So taking this into consideration, in my opinion, there'll be some people who may be interested in buying an EU4 board game. But the size of the market is unclear, especially considering the potential complexity of having it as a board game. It definitely wouldn't be the Christmas board game families play, and to be frank, something like the board games of Risk and Monopoly would most likely be more simple for people to understand and accessible to the wider market. So how did this gaming company plan to make the revival of an EU4 board game viable to make a good earning? Which brings us on to the next section. So, how have the gaming company decided to revive the game, and what was their strategy? Well, one thing they did is to do dev diaries on the Paradox forums. Starting in 2017, this allowed EU4 players to see regular updates and comment on the new features of the board game. This allowed them to build a small community, and in a sense, it created hype around the board game over time. The gaming company also most importantly used Kickstarter in order to raise capital for the game, and that Kickstarter campaign was able to get over 4,000 backers. This was definitely the key to making it viable, since the board game makers were able to raise over $500,000 US. In return for the money, the backers came a part of the board game, and their faces were added as advisors and leaders. Another thing to consider is although the market is niche, the price consumers are willing to pay for the Europa Universalis board game is relatively high, and therefore the revival, despite on the surface being limited in value capture of the market, it does potentially make sense given the fact that people are willing to buy the EU board game that costs over £100, whether the same individuals would be far less willing to pay the same price for board games in the mass market. For example, Monopoly is only £20, and Risk, which is a somewhat similar game in concept, but far less simplistic to the Europa Universalis board game, costs around £25. Now sadly, I don't have over £100 to spend on this board game, but what I do have is the next best thing, Tabletop Simulator. Just by having a glance at the map, you can tell this is not as simple as Uno. Even though I have lots of hours in EU4, I'm struggling to understand what I'm looking at. The rules are long and complicated, with the board game developers making a 40-page booklet containing thousands of words, outlining every single rule in the game. I won't lie, but it probably would take around a day to get your head around the rules, and even the most dedicated EU4 players may struggle to remember every single rule, with a lot of comments asking for clarification on the pages. It therefore wouldn't be accessible to the average person who has no knowledge of EU4. What I will say though, is that many EU4 players would find the complexity of this interesting, as shown by all the backers, and this level of complexity gives the board game high replayability. But would something like EU4 Top Trumps, although much more simplistic, be more accessible and potentially be more successful than the highly complex EU4 board game? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Moving on from the rules of the game, the map is certainly pleasing to the eye, with a lot of detail, and even though there are less countries on the map than those in EU4, because it is probably simply not possible to include them all, and would make it even more complicated than it already is. The amount of countries gives the game variety, and it makes it very replayable, although there are a lot of other interesting things about this game, with naval units and military units looking good. The game also has customised events and missions, with over 100 cards you can pick from as well. There are also some unique country events added in. I have to admit, the amount of effort and length they went to make this game is really quite incredible. According to Board Game Geek, the game takes 1.5 hours to nearly 5 hours to complete. So if you are actually thinking of getting this game, you may need to have a bit more free time. So to conclude, despite the initial bizarreness with developing a new EU4 board game that may almost feel like an innovation regression to the mid-1990s, this board game, although limited in market size, actually has been relatively successful and gives another product to the Europa Universalis series that has not flopped. Would you get this board game though, or do you think you would rather stick with EU4 for now? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you for watching this video.